The homeless boy's hands trembled as he pressed down on the little girl's chest. Her father, leather vest, Hell's Angel's patch, was charging toward him with fury blazing in his eyes. Daniel had mere seconds to bring her back before everything spiraled out of control. What unfolded in the next 60 seconds would transform his life forever. And what happened 72 hours later? Nobody in that neighborhood saw it coming. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. The afternoon sun hung low over Riverside Drive, casting long golden shadows across the weathered sidewalk where wildflowers pushed through concrete like small acts of rebellion. It was the kind of light that softened everything, made the world seem kinder, like the entire neighborhood had been dipped in amber. The air was warm but not oppressive, carrying the scent of freshly mowed lawns and the distant promise of summer evenings that stretch on endlessly. In this light, even the mundane seemed touched by magic. The weathered green mailboxes, the chain-link fences, the modest brick houses with their tidy little yards, everything glowed. And there, moving through this golden hour like she was part of the light itself, was a little girl on a pink bicycle. Her name was Sophie Bennett, 7 years old, with dark curls bouncing against her shoulders and a gap-toothed smile that could melt the hardest heart. The bicycle was her pride and joy, metallic pink with white handlebar streamers that caught the breeze, a small bell she rang at every corner, and a basket on the front that currently held a stuffed bunny named Buttons. She'd gotten the bike for her birthday 3 months ago, and since then, she'd ridden it every single day. Rain or shine, hot or cold, Sophie and that pink bicycle were inseparable. She knew every crack in the sidewalk, every place where the concrete buckled from tree roots, every house where a dog might bark, every corner where she needed to slow down. This was her route, her territory, the small kingdom she ruled from her bicycle seat. She'd pedaled this same path so many times she could probably do it with her eyes closed, though her father always told her that was a terrible idea, and please never try it. Sophie pedaled with the confidence of a child who'd never known real danger. Her legs pumped in steady rhythm, her hands gripped the handlebars with casual certainty, and her face held that particular expression of pure contentment that only children can achieve, complete presence in the moment. No thought for yesterday or tomorrow. Just the joy of movement and sunshine and being exactly where she wanted to be. What Sophie couldn't know, was that she had exactly 43 seconds before her world went dark. 43 seconds of normalcy, of innocence, of believing that today was just like every other day. That she'd ride home, park her bike in the garage, and run inside to tell her dad about her day at school. 43 seconds before everything changed. But those 43 seconds, they were still hers. Still perfect. Still untouched by what was coming. She rang her bell as she passed Mrs. Patel's house, even though Mrs. Patel wasn't outside. It was tradition. Then she waved at the Hendersons' orange tabby cat sitting in the window, another tradition. The cat flicked its tail in what Sophie chose to interpret as a wave back. These small rituals mattered to her. They were the threads that stitched her world together, made it feel safe and known and wonderfully, beautifully predictable. From the alley between 7th and 8th Street, someone else was watching. His name was Daniel, though most people in this neighborhood didn't know that, because most people in this neighborhood didn't see him at all. 10 years old, he'd mastered the art of invisibility. Not the magical kind, but the kind that comes from necessity, from survival, from learning that sometimes being unseen is safer than being noticed. He stood in the shadows between a dumpster and a chain-link fence, his small frame almost swallowed by clothes that were 3 sizes too big. The jeans were held up with a rope belt. The jacket was stained and torn at one elbow. The sneakers had holes in both toes and didn't match, one was navy, one was black. Because when you're taking shoes from a donation bin behind the community center at 3 a.m., you don't have the luxury of finding a matching pair. Daniel's face was smudged with dirt, his hair an uneven mess because he tried to cut it himself with a pair of scissors he'd found. And his eyes held something that no 10-year-old's eyes should hold, a weary understanding of how cruel the world could be. He'd been living on these streets for 6 months. Before that, there had been foster homes, 3 of them in 2 years. Each one proving that not all houses are homes. That sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you most need protection from. So he'd run. Just walked out one day and decided that sleeping in abandoned buildings and eating from soup kitchens was better than pretending to be grateful for a roof that came with bruises and criticism and the constant reminder that he was a burden nobody really wanted. The streets had their own dangers, but at least they were honest about it. Daniel had claimed this alley as one of his spots. It was relatively safe, well lit enough that no one bothered him at night, hidden enough that most people walked past without looking in. He'd wedged a flattened cardboard box behind the dumpster where he could sleep if the condemned building 3 blocks over got too cold or too crowded with other homeless folks. He'd stashed a backpack with his few possessions, some granola bars he'd saved from the shelter, a library book he'd borrowed and would probably never be able to return, and a photograph of his mother that was creased and faded from being handled too much. His mother. That's where this all started, really. Where the Invisible Boy's story began. She'd been everything to him. Jessica Rivera, 28 years old, working 2 jobs, raising a son on her own, and doing it all with a smile that made Daniel believe everything would be okay. She sang while she cooked. She helped him with homework even when she was exhausted. She called him her little miracle, and meant it with her whole heart. And then one day, when Daniel was 8 years old, she'd collapsed in their apartment. Just fell. One moment she was standing at the stove making eggs, and the next moment she was on the floor, unconscious, and 8-year-old Daniel had no idea what to do. He'd called 911, his small fingers shaking so hard he could barely press the buttons. And he'd waited beside her, holding her hand, telling her to wake up. Please wake up. Please, the paramedic said she'd had a cardiac event, undiagnosed heart condition. Nothing anyone could have predicted. Nothing anyone could have prevented. She died at the hospital 3 days later, and Daniel's world ended with her. That was 2 years ago. Sometimes it felt like 2 lifetimes. Now, standing in his alley, Daniel watched the world pass by like he was separated from it by thick glass. He watched people come and go, families walking together, kids laughing, parents holding hands, and he felt the familiar ache of being outside of life, looking in. He'd been watching this little girl on her pink bicycle for weeks now. She rode past his alley almost every day around the same time, always with that same joyful expression, always so confident and safe and loved. He wondered what that felt like, to be loved, to be safe, to have somewhere to go. He'd never spoken to her, never even thought about it. You don't approach when you're invisible. You don't insert yourself into the bright, normal world of people who belong. You just watch. You just remember what it used to feel like, back when you belonged too. The little girl pedaled closer, her streamers dancing in the breeze, and Daniel found himself smiling just a little. There was something about her joy that was contagious, that reached even into his shadows and reminded him that good things still existed in the world, even if they weren't for him. She rang her bell. The clear, cheerful sound echoed down the street. And then something changed. Daniel saw it before she did. The way her hands suddenly went to her chest. The way her pedaling faltered, just a tiny hesitation, barely noticeable. But Daniel noticed. He'd spent 2 years watching people, learning to read the small signs that most folks missed. He saw the confusion cross her face, saw her try to shake it off, to keep pedaling. The bicycle wobbled. Sophie's other hand left the handlebar, both palms now pressed against her chest like she was trying to hold something in, or keep something out. Her face went pale, all that sun-kissed color draining away in seconds. The bike swerved left, then right. Her feet slipped off the pedals. Daniel took a step forward, some instinct telling him something was very, very wrong. The little girl's eyes went unfocused. Her body went slack. And then, as if someone had simply turned her off, she fell. Not a dramatic fall, not a cinematic tumble with flailing arms and screams. Just, gone. Consciousness severed like a cut wire. Her small body tilted sideways and crumpled to the pavement with the awful, heavy sound of dead weight hitting concrete. The bicycle crashed beside her, wheels still spinning, streamers tangled, buttons thrown from the basket onto the sidewalk. For a moment, everything stopped. The world held its breath. Daniel stood frozen at the edge of his alley, his mind refusing to process what his eyes had just seen. The sunny afternoon suddenly felt wrong, like the light was lying, like the warmth was a trick. Because warm, safe afternoons aren't supposed to contain moments like this. Children on pink bicycles aren't supposed to just fall and not get up. But she wasn't getting up. She lay on the sidewalk, one arm bent underneath her at an angle that looked painful, her dark curls spread across the concrete, her eyes closed. Her chest, not moving. Not moving, that's what broke through Daniel's shock. The realization that her chest wasn't rising and falling. That she wasn't breathing. That this wasn't a simple fall or a scraped knee or something that a band-aid and a hug could fix. This was the moment. The one he'd been too young to recognize 2 years ago. The one he'd been helpless during. The one that had taken his mother while he sat beside her, holding her hand, doing nothing because he didn't know what else to do. But he wasn't that helpless 8-year-old anymore. Daniel's feet moved before his brain fully caught up. He ran from the alley, his mismatched shoes slapping against the pavement, his oversized jacket flapping behind him. He ran the way you run when seconds matter, when hesitation means death, when every moment of delay is unforgivable. He reached her in 5 seconds. Dropped to his knees beside her in 6. Up close, she looked even smaller, even more fragile. Her skin had taken on a grayish tint, and there was already a scrape forming on her cheek from where she'd hit the ground. Daniel's hands hovered over her, shaking, his mind racing through fragments of memory, pieces of information he'd collected 6 months ago at a shelter on the other side of town. It had been a Tuesday night. Daniel had been sleeping in an abandoned warehouse, but it was January, and the cold was the kind that could kill you. So he'd swallowed his pride and gone to the 3rd Street shelter for a hot meal and a place to sleep. They'd been running a community training program that evening, CPR and basic first aid, taught by a volunteer named Ms. Lee, who worked as a nurse at Riverside General Hospital. Most of the adults in the shelter hadn't paid much attention. They'd been there for the food and warmth, not the education. But Daniel had watched every single demonstration, had listened to every word, had asked questions after everyone else had shuffled off to their cots. "Why do you want to know all this, sweetie?" Ms. Lee had asked him, her voice kind but curious. "Just in case," Daniel had said. "I want to be ready. Just in case." He'd been thinking about his mother, about that awful moment when he'd stood helpless, about the promise he'd made to himself in the 2 years since, that he'd never be unprepared again. That if someone collapsed in front of him, he'd know what to do. He'd never expected it to be a little girl on a pink bicycle. Daniel checked her breathing the way Ms. Lee had taught him, leaned close, watched her chest, felt for air against his cheek. Nothing. She wasn't breathing. His heart hammered against his ribs. His hands shook worse. But somewhere underneath the fear, there was something else, a strange, cold clarity. A sense of purpose that cut through the panic like a blade. He couldn't save his mother. But maybe he could save this girl. Daniel tilted her head back gently, the way he'd been shown. Checked her airway. Pinched her nose. Gave 2 rescue breaths, watching her chest rise slightly with each one. Then he positioned his hands over her sternum, one palm over the other, fingers interlaced. He'd practiced this on the training dummy 6 months ago, pressing down until Ms. Lee said he had the depth right. He'd thought then that he'd never actually use this. That it was just information, just preparation, just a way to feel less helpless in a world that had proven itself to be overwhelmingly cruel. Now, kneeling on a sun-warmed sidewalk beside a 7-year-old girl who wasn't breathing, Daniel understood that preparation and desperation were 2 sides of the same coin. He pressed down. *30 compressions. Ms. Lee had said hard and fast. Don't be afraid to push. You're trying to manually pump blood to the brain. Broken ribs heal. Brain death doesn't. Daniel counted in his head, his thin arms working, his whole body putting weight into each compression. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, her small chest compressed under his hands. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, he couldn't think about how fragile she looked. 14, 15, 16, couldn't think about whether he was doing this right. 17, 18, 19, could only count. 20, 21, 22, could only push. 23, 24, 25, could only hope. 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 2 breaths. 30 more compressions. His world narrowed to this, to the rhythm, to the count, to the desperate attempt to force life back into a small body that had given up. The street was still quiet. Nobody else had noticed yet. The crash of the bicycle hadn't been loud enough to draw attention, and Daniel was just a homeless kid kneeling on a sidewalk, the kind of thing people's eyes skipped over, even when they looked directly at it. But across the street, in the driveway of a small brick house, someone had noticed. Ryan Bennett was unloading groceries from the back of his pickup truck, moving with the efficient casualness of a man who'd done this routine 100 times. He was a big man, 6 feet 2 inches, broad-shouldered, with tattooed arms and a salt and pepper beard that he kept neatly trimmed. He wore jeans, boots, and a leather vest that proclaimed his affiliation with a simple patch across the back, Hell's Angels, Vice President, Riverside Chapter. Ryan had been with the club for 12 years, had earned his patch through loyalty and brotherhood and the kind of bonds that were forged in fire and sealed in blood. The Hell's Angels weren't what the movies made them out to be. Not entirely. Sure, there was history there. Sure, there were rules and codes and things that happened in the shadows that didn't need to see daylight. But the club was also family. The club was protection. The club was belonging to something bigger than yourself, being part of a brotherhood that would ride through hell for you if you needed it. Ryan had needed it once, years ago, and the club had shown up. So he'd given his life to it, proudly wore the patch, rode with his brothers every Sunday, showed up when they called. But before he was Hell's Angels vice president, before he was Brother Ryan, before any of that, he was Sophie's father. Single dad. His ex-wife had left when Sophie was 2, decided that motherhood and small-town life weren't the adventure she'd signed up for. She'd moved to Portland, sent birthday cards sometimes, called on Christmas if she remembered. It had hurt like hell at the time, but Ryan had learned to see it as a blessing, because it meant Sophie was his. His to raise, his to protect, his to love with a fierceness that sometimes scared him with its intensity. Sophie was his whole world. Everything else, the club, the brotherhood, the reputation, all of it was secondary to that little girl with the gap-toothed smile and the pink bicycle. He'd just set down a bag of groceries when he turned around to grab another one and caught movement in his peripheral vision. Saw Sophie's bicycle. Saw it wobble. Saw her fall. His heart stopped. For a fraction of a second, Ryan's brain tried to rationalize it. Asterisk kids fall off bikes all the time. She's fine. She's getting up, asterisk, but she wasn't getting up. And there was someone kneeling over her. Some kid. Some dirty kid in oversized clothes, putting his hands on Sophie. Ryan didn't think, didn't process, didn't analyze. He ran. 12 years in the Hells Angels. 20 years of bar fights and street brawls and situations where violence was the language everyone spoke. All of that muscle memory kicked in instantly. Asterisk someone was over his daughter. Someone had put hands on his little girl, asterisk Ryan sprinted across the street with the kind of speed that defied his size, his boots pounding pavement, his vision tunneling until all he could see was Sophie's prone body and a stranger hunched over her. He was yelling before he even fully registered what he was saying. Get away from her. Get your hands off my daughter. The words came out like thunder, like rage, like every protective instinct a father possesses concentrated into a single roar. Daniel heard it, heard the fury, heard the pounding footsteps, heard death coming for him wrapped in leather and fury. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because he was on compression 19 of his second cycle, and if he stopped now, this girl would die. So his hands kept pushing, kept counting, kept fighting for her life, even as a giant of a man charged toward him with murder in his eyes. Asterisk 21. 22, 23, asterisk Ryan was 10 feet away, his face a mask of terror and rage, his hands reaching out to grab this kid, to throw him aside, to protect his daughter from whatever this was. Asterisk 26. 27, 28, asterisk 5 feet away. Close enough that Daniel could see the tattoos on Ryan's arms, could see the Hells Angels patch, could see the absolute conviction in this man's eyes that Daniel was a threat that needed to be eliminated. Asterisk 29. 30, asterisk Ryan's hand closed on Daniel's collar, fingers gripping the worn fabric, ready to yank him away. And Sophie gasped. It wasn't a dramatic gasp, not a movie gasp with flailing and coughing and immediate full consciousness. Just a small, wet intake of breath. Her chest rose on its own. Fell. Rose again. Ryan froze. His hand still gripped Daniel's collar, but his eyes were locked on his daughter, on the rise and fall of her chest, on the color slowly creeping back into her face, on the small movement of her fingers. Daniel had stopped compressions the moment she gasped, his hand still hovering over her chest, ready to start again if needed. He was breathing hard, his arms shaking from exertion, his face pale, but his eyes held something beyond fear. They held desperate hope. She's breathing, Daniel whispered. She's breathing. Sophie's eyes fluttered open, confused, disoriented. She looked up at the sky, then at the faces above her. Her father's terrified expression. The strange boy's exhausted relief. Daddy? Her voice was small and hoarse. What happened? Ryan dropped to his knees so fast it should have hurt. His hand released Daniel's collar, forgotten, as both arms reached for Sophie instead. He gathered her up carefully, checking her over with shaking hands, looking for injuries, for explanations, for understanding. "Baby, you fell. You stopped breathing." His voice cracked on the words. This man, who'd faced down rival gangs without flinching, who'd been in situations where showing fear meant showing weakness, was openly crying. Tears cut tracks through the dust on his face as he held his daughter. "I don't remember," Sophie said, still confused. "I was riding my bike, and then. I don't know. Everything went dark." Ryan pulled her closer, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other wrapped around her small body like he could physically hold her to this world through sheer force of will. He was shaking. This giant, tattooed biker was shaking like a leaf. "You're okay," he said, but it sounded like he was trying to convince himself. "You're okay. You're okay." Over Sophie's shoulder, Ryan's eyes found Daniel. The boy had backed up a few feet, ready to run, looking like a wild animal that expected to be hit. And Ryan realized, really realized, what had just happened. This kid, this dirty, homeless kid that Ryan had been about to throw across the street, he'd been doing CPR. He'd been saving Sophie's life. Ryan had charged at him, screaming threats, and the kid had just kept going. Kept doing compressions. Kept fighting for a stranger's life even with danger bearing down on him. Kept going when he could have run. Kept going when any sane person would have protected themselves first. Kept going because a little girl needed saving, and nothing else mattered. The silence that followed was profound. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. The spinning wheels of Sophie's bicycle finally came to rest. The afternoon sun continued its golden pour across the scene, indifferent to the miracle that had just unfolded. Ryan stared at Daniel. Daniel stared back, still poised to flee, still not quite believing he wasn't about to get hurt. "You." Ryan's voice came out rough. "You saved her." Daniel didn't respond. Didn't know how to respond. His whole body was still flooded with adrenaline, his mind still caught in the loop of compressions and breaths and "Please live, please live, please live, you saved my daughter's life." Ryan said it again, like he needed to speak it aloud to make it real. Daniel's eyes darted to Sophie, who was now sitting up in her father's arms, looking confused but alive, breathing, present. The grayish tint was gone from her skin. Her eyes were clear. She was okay. She was okay. The weight of that hit Daniel all at once, and his legs gave out. He sat down hard on the sidewalk, his breathing coming in shaky gasps, his hands trembling in his lap. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. The thing he'd been too young and too scared to do for his mother, he'd done it for this little girl. He'd saved her. If you've ever felt invisible, truly invisible, like you're a ghost moving through a world that doesn't see you or acknowledge your existence, then you know what Daniel felt in that moment. You know the weight of being overlooked, of having people's eyes slide past you like you're not even there, of wondering if you even matter at all to anyone. But in that moment, on that sidewalk, with a little girl breathing and a giant of a man staring at him with tears running down his face, Daniel wasn't invisible. He was seen, he was real, he mattered, and sometimes that's what heroes look like. Not people in capes or uniforms or shining armor. Sometimes heroes are 10-year-old boys in second-hand shoes that don't fit, living in alleys, eating from soup kitchens, carrying everything they own in a torn backpack. Sometimes heroes are the ones everyone else has decided aren't worth looking at. Sometimes courage comes from the places we least expect. Sometimes the people we ignore are the ones most ready to save us. The morning after Sophie came home from the hospital, Ryan Bennett woke up with a singular purpose burning in his chest. Find the boy. Find Daniel. The doctors had confirmed what Ryan already knew in his bones. Without that CPR, without those crucial minutes of someone fighting for her life, Sophie would have died on that sidewalk. Brain damage at minimum. More likely, she simply wouldn't have made it. A 10-year-old homeless kid had saved his daughter's life and then vanished like smoke. Ryan couldn't let that stand. Wouldn't let it stand. He started where all searches begin, at the beginning. The spot where it happened. He stood on that sidewalk in the morning light, Sophie's pink bicycle now safely in their garage, and looked at the alley where Daniel had emerged from. Empty now. Just a gap between buildings, a dumpster, some scattered trash. Nothing that suggested a child lived there. But someone had to know something. Ryan walked into Patel's Corner Market first, the little family-owned shop that had been on this block for 30 years. Mrs. Patel looked up from behind the counter, and her expression shifted when she saw the Hells Angels patch on his vest. Not fear, exactly. But caution. The careful neutrality of someone who'd learned that survival meant not getting involved. Morning, Ryan said, working to keep his voice gentle. I'm looking for information about a kid. 10 years old, thin, wearing oversized clothes. Might come around here sometimes. Mrs. Patel's face gave nothing away. Many kids come in here. This one's homeless. Living on the streets. He saved my daughter's life yesterday, and I need to find him. Need to thank him. Something flickered in Mrs. Patel's eyes, recognition, maybe sympathy, but she shook her head. I mind my business. You should too. It went like that all morning. The bodega owner who suddenly didn't speak English well enough to understand the question. The postal worker who'd seen nothing, knew nothing, remembered nothing. The regular sitting outside the laundromat who got very interested in his phone the moment Ryan approached. Nobody wanted to talk to the Hells Angel about the homeless kid. And Ryan understood why. In neighborhoods like this, you survive by staying invisible, by not drawing attention, by never volunteering information to anyone who looked like they might have authority or power. The patch on his back might mean brotherhood to him, but to them, it meant trouble, questions, complications they couldn't afford. What Ryan didn't know yet was that Daniel was watching him from a parking garage 3 blocks away, terrified that the man had come back angry, terrified that yesterday's miracle was about to become today's nightmare. 2 days of searching had taught Ryan Bennett patience he didn't know he possessed. 2 days of dead ends and closed doors and people who looked right through him when he asked about a homeless boy named Daniel. 2 days of Sophie asking when she could thank the boy who saved her, and Ryan having no answer to give. On the 3rd day, Ryan tried the public library. It was a long shot, but Ms. Garcia at the community center had mentioned, off the record, voice low like she was sharing classified information, that sometimes the street kids went there. Warm in winter, cool in summer, free bathrooms. Nobody bothered you if you looked like you were reading. Ryan pushed through the heavy doors into the hushed sanctuary of books and fluorescent lighting. The librarian at the front desk glanced at his vest, his boots, his general appearance, and her hand moved subtly toward the phone. He was used to that reaction. Just looking for someone, Ryan said quietly, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. A kid. I'm not here to cause trouble. He found Daniel in the back corner, tucked into a chair that was too big for him, a book open in his lap. The boy looked smaller somehow than he had on that sidewalk, more fragile, like he was trying to fold himself into invisibility, to take up as little space as possible in a world that had made it clear there wasn't room for him. Daniel's head snapped up the moment Ryan rounded the bookshelf. His eyes went wide. His body tensed, every muscle coiled to run. Ryan stopped moving. Held perfectly still, the way you might freeze when encountering a deer on a trail, knowing that any sudden movement would send it bounding away into the trees. "Hey," Ryan said, barely above a whisper. Then he did something Daniel clearly didn't expect. He sat down. Not in the chair next to Daniel, that would be too close, too threatening, but on the floor, back against the bookshelf opposite, creating distance and lowering himself so he wasn't looming over the boy. Ryan didn't speak again, didn't ask questions, didn't make demands. He simply reached into the bag he'd been carrying and pulled out a sandwich, turkey and cheese from the deli, chips, an apple, a bottle of water. He placed them on the floor between himself and Daniel. An offering. No strings attached. Then Ryan pulled out a book he'd grabbed randomly from a shelf on his way over and opened it. Pretended to read. Gave Daniel space to decide what happened next. The silence stretched. 1 minute. 5 minutes. 10. Daniel's eyes kept darting between Ryan, the food, and the nearest exit. Calculating. Weighing risk against hunger, trust against survival instinct. 15 minutes. 20. Ryan turned a page he hadn't actually read. Waited. At 30 minutes, Daniel whispered, "Is your daughter okay?" Ryan looked up, met those weary eyes. "She's perfect. Because of you." The next morning, Daniel returned to his spot near the alley. It was routine now, the small rituals that structured his days. Morning at the library when it opened. Afternoon near the alley where he could watch the world pass by. Evening at the shelter if they had space, or the condemned building 3 blocks over if they didn't. Survival was about patterns, about knowing where to be and when, about making yourself small enough that trouble passed you by. He was sitting on the cracked curb, the backpack Ryan had returned to him yesterday resting against his legs, when he heard it. At first, it was just a distant rumble. Thunder, maybe. A truck passing on the highway. Something he could ignore. But then it got louder. Closer. Not thunder at all, but something mechanical and purposeful and moving in his direction with absolute certainty. One motorcycle. Then another. Then more. The sound built like a wave rolling down the quiet residential street where nothing louder than a lawn mower usually disturbed the peace. 3 motorcycles became 5. 5 became 10. The rumble became a roar that shook windows and set off car alarms and pulled people from their houses to see what catastrophe was headed their way. 10 became 15. 15 became 20. 20 became 23. Neighbors emerged onto porches. Mrs. Patel stepped out of her store, hands shading her eyes. Parents grabbed their children, pulled them close. Everyone knew that patch. Everyone knew what Hell's Angels meant. Asterisk trouble. Violence. The kind of danger you didn't ask questions about. You just got out of the way and hoped it passed you by. Asterisk the convoy rolled down Riverside Drive like thunder given form. Chrome gleaming in the morning sun. Leather and metal and the raw power of 23 motorcycles moving in perfect formation. And they stopped. In front of Daniel. Every single one. Engines cutting off in sequence until the roar faded to silence, and 23 men sat astride their bikes, facing a 10-year-old boy who'd frozen with his back against a chain-link fence and nowhere to run. Ryan stepped off his bike first. He walked toward Daniel slowly, deliberately, and the boy's eyes were wide with confusion and fear and complete inability to understand what was happening. "We've been looking for you, brother," Ryan said. Brother, not kid. Not boy. Not even his name. Brother. Daniel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Behind Ryan, 23 grown men, leather vests decorated with patches earned through loyalty and blood, tattoos covering arms that had seen fights and scars and hard years, faces weathered by lives lived on the edge, stood in formation. And they'd come for a homeless 10-year-old who owned nothing but a torn backpack and oversized clothes. Ryan reached into his saddlebag and pulled out something wrapped in brown paper. He knelt down, bringing himself to Daniel's eye level, and held it out. Open it, Ryan said gently. Daniel's hands shook as he unwrapped the package. Inside was leather, soft and supple and clearly new. A vest. Child-sized. Custom-made. No patches yet, but the leather itself was protection. Belonging. Family, you saved one of ours, Ryan said. That makes you one of ours. The Hells Angels had a reputation in this neighborhood. 20 years of leather vests and rumbling engines and the kind of presence that made people cross the street. They were the men mothers warned their children about, the club that police watched carefully, the brotherhood that operated by rules most folks didn't understand and didn't want to. But the Hells Angels also had connections, and Ryan Bennett knew exactly how to use them. The bike shop on 9th Street had been there for 40 years, run by a man named Hector who'd sold Ryan his first motorcycle back when Ryan was 19 and stupid and thought speed was the same thing as freedom. Hector owed the club nothing. But when Ryan walked in and told him about a 10-year-old boy who'd saved his daughter's life, who'd performed CPR on a sidewalk while Ryan had been ready to throw him aside, who now had nothing but needed everything, Hector listened. Kid needs a bike, Ryan said simply. Something reliable. Something that says he belongs here. 2 days later, there was a bicycle. Not pink like Sophie's, but blue and silver with sturdy tires and a bell that actually worked. Hector didn't ask for payment. Just nodded when Ryan came to pick it up and said, "Tell the kid to ride safe." The landlord on 10th Street was harder. Bernard Morrison had 42 rental properties and a reputation for being tighter with money than bark on a tree. But he also had daughters, 3 daughters, actually. And when Ryan sat across from him in that cramped office that smelled like coffee and old paperwork and told the story, told it, every detail, the fall and the CPR and the boy who'd vanished into shadows, Bernard's expression changed. I got a studio, Bernard said finally. Above the dry cleaners. Been empty 6 months. Need some work. How much? Ryan asked. Bernard looked at him for a long moment. You Hells Angels. You take care of your own, right? Always. Then I guess the kid's one of yours now. First year's free. After that, we'll talk. The school principal, Mrs. Thompson, had told the Hells Angels, no, 100 times over the years. No, you can't hold your charity motorcycle run through the school parking lot. No, you can't recruit at career day. No, you can't use the gymnasium for your meetings. She had rules, policies, procedures that didn't bend for anyone. But she'd also been an educator for 33 years, and she understood what it meant when a child fell through the cracks. When Ryan showed up at her office, not demanding, not intimidating, just asking, and told her about Daniel, about his mother dying, about foster care failures, about a boy who'd learned CPR because he promised himself he'd never be unprepared again. Mrs. Thompson's rules suddenly had room for exceptions. Bring him in Monday, she said. We'll get him enrolled. The doctor. The grocery store. The community center. Ryan told the story everywhere. And somehow, when a Hell's Angel asked you to help save a kid who'd already saved someone else, no, became impossible. 3 days after the motorcycles rolled down Riverside Drive, Daniel walked into his new apartment for the first time. It was small, just one room with a tiny kitchen and a bathroom that barely fit a shower. But it was clean. It was safe. It had a lock on the door that Daniel controlled. And in the center of the empty room sat a bed, a desk, and a note written in Ryan's blocky handwriting, * will help you fill it. Welcome home. Your brother's *. Daniel stood in that doorway and cried for the first time in 2 years. But there was a problem. 3 days after that, social services showed up. Her name was Karen Mitchell, and she'd been a caseworker for Child Protective Services for 11 years. She'd seen everything. Homes that looked perfect on the outside but hid horrors behind closed doors. Parents who meant well but couldn't provide. Children who'd learned to lie to protect the adults who hurt them. 11 years had taught her to trust the system, follow the procedures, and never let emotion override protocol. When the anonymous call came in about a 10-year-old living alone in an apartment above a dry cleaner's, being supported by members of a motorcycle club, every alarm in Karen's training went off at once. She showed up on a Thursday afternoon, clipboard in hand, ready to document what she already suspected she'd find. She knocked on the door of that studio apartment, and when Daniel answered, this small boy with weary eyes and clothes that finally fit, she saw exactly what her training told her to see. Red flags everywhere, a child living alone. No legal guardian on the premises. Financial support coming from a motorcycle club with a documented history of criminal activity. A 10-year-old who should be in school, in the system, in a proper foster placement with background-checked adults and regular oversight. Karen saw danger where there was love. Saw criminals where there were heroes. Saw a boy who needed saving from the very people who'd already saved him. Are you Daniel Rivera? She asked, her voice professional and distant. Daniel nodded, his hand tight on the door frame, already understanding that this woman represented everything he'd been running from. I'm from Child Protective Services. I need to ask you some questions about your living situation. Within an hour, Karen had filled 3 pages with notes. Within 2 hours, she'd spoken to the landlord, the neighbors, and tracked down Ryan Bennett. Within 3 hours, she'd filed an emergency petition with the family court. Ryan stood in that cramped CPS office, hands clenched at his sides, trying to keep his voice level. You know what that kid did? He saved my daughter's life. Performed CPR on a sidewalk when she stopped breathing. Where were you then? Where was the system when he was sleeping in condemned buildings? When he was eating from dumpsters? When he was invisible and nobody cared? Karen's face remained neutral. Mr. Bennett, I understand you're grateful, but gratitude doesn't qualify someone as a guardian. You have a criminal record. You're affiliated with an organization that what? That showed up for him. That gave him a home. That made sure he had food and clothes and people who actually see him. Mr. Bennett, the law is clear. A minor cannot live without proper guardianship. If you want to pursue legal custody, there's a process. Until then, Daniel needs to be placed in emergency foster care. The words hit Ryan like a physical blow. Foster care, the same system that had failed Daniel before. The same cycle that had left him running for the streets because anything was better than another house that wasn't home. You can't, Ryan said, his voice breaking. You can't put him back in that. I don't have a choice, Karen said, and she almost sounded sorry. I'm filing the paperwork now. The caseworker made her notes. Forms were filed. And for 72 hours, Daniel and Ryan waited to learn if the system would tear apart what courage had built. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning. Family Court. Judge Margaret Lawson presiding. Ryan had never been so terrified in his life, and he'd faced down situations where terror was the appropriate response. But this was different. This was watching someone he'd promised to protect being taken away by rules and regulations and people who'd never bothered to ask what Daniel actually needed. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, with fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and cold. Ryan sat at one table with a lawyer the club had paid for, a good one, expensive, the kind who usually defended them against very different charges. Daniel sat beside him, wearing new clothes that Sophie had helped pick out, looking smaller than ever in the formal setting. Karen Mitchell sat at the other table with the county attorney. And in the gallery behind Ryan, 23 Hells Angels filled the benches, silent and watchful. The character witnesses came one by one. Ms. Lee *** from the shelter, who testified about the CPR class, about how Daniel had paid attention like his life depended on it, had asked questions, had wanted to be ready. The library coordinator, who talked about finding Daniel there every day, reading, learning, never causing trouble, just trying to better himself with the only resources he had access to. Sophie's doctor, who explained the medical reality, ** without CPR, Sophie Bennett would have died. And the person who saved her is sitting right there, ** neighbors testified about the transformation they'd witnessed. The boy who'd been invisible suddenly seen, suddenly cared for, suddenly thriving under the protection of men the system wanted to label as dangerous. And then Sophie walked up to the judge's bench. 7 years old in a yellow dress, clutching a piece of paper that she'd folded and unfolded so many times it was soft as cloth. Judge Lawson leaned down. "Hello, sweetheart. What do you have there?" Sophie unfolded the drawing. It showed a girl on a bike, an angel without wings wearing oversized clothes, and the words written in careful crayon, ** he saved me. "Don't take him away, ** that's Daniel," Sophie said, her voice small but certain. "He's my hero. And he's my daddy's brother now. You can't take brothers away from each other. That's not fair." Judge Margaret Lawson had been on the bench for 19 years. Before that, she'd served in the Marine Corps for 12. She knew the Hells Angels by reputation, had presided over cases involving the club, had sent some of their members to prison, had no illusions about who they were or what they were capable of. But she also knew what service looked like. What brotherhood meant. What it meant when grown men showed up in force, not to intimidate, but to stand witness for a child. She looked at Ryan. "Mr. Bennett, you understand the responsibility you're requesting?" "Yes, Your Honor. More than anything. And you understand that this court will be monitoring this placement? That any violation, any sign that this child is in danger, will result in immediate removal?" "Yes, Your Honor. I understand." Judge Lawson looked at Daniel. "Young man, is this what you want?" Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. Temporary guardianship granted to Ryan Bennett, pending full adoption proceedings. Case management will conduct regular home visits. We'll reconvene in 6 months to assess permanent placement. The gavel came down. The courtroom erupted, not with cheers, this wasn't that kind of victory, but with the release of held breath, with relief, with the weight of fear lifting. Daniel collapsed into Ryan's arms. This boy who'd learned not to cry, who'd taught himself to be strong, finally letting himself break because he was safe enough to fall apart. And in the back row, 23 Hells Angels stood up. Not cheering, not celebrating. Just standing. In respect. In recognition. Brothers welcoming a brother home. 6 months can feel like forever when you're 10 years old. 6 months ago, Daniel Rivera had been invisible. A ghost boy living in alleys, eating from shelter lines, carrying everything he owned in a torn backpack. 6 months ago, family was a photograph of a mother he'd lost and a dream he'd stopped believing could come true. Now, on a Tuesday morning in October, Daniel walked through the front doors of Lincoln Elementary with a backpack full of actual school supplies and a lunch that Ryan had packed that morning. The other kids knew his name. Some of them were even his friends, real friends, the kind who saved him seats at lunch and picked him for their team in gym class and invited him to birthday parties. Mrs. Thompson, the principal who'd bent her rules to let him enroll, watched him navigate the hallway with the easy confidence of a child who finally believed he belonged somewhere. She'd seen a lot of transformations in 33 years of education, but something about this one felt different. Felt like proof that the system could work when people chose to make it work. After school, Daniel rode his bicycle home, the blue and silver one from Hector's shop that he'd named Thunder because it sounded tough and free at the same time. Ryan jogged beside him like he did every day, close enough to catch him if he fell, but far enough back to let him find his own balance. They'd been doing this for months now, these afternoon rides through the neighborhood, and Daniel had gone from wobbly uncertainty to confident speed. "You're getting too fast for me, kid," Ryan called out, slightly winded. "You're just getting old," Daniel shot back, grinning over his shoulder. "Watch it, or I'll make you do dishes for a month." They both laughed, this easy banter that felt like home. Dinner that evening was spaghetti, Sophie's favorite, and they sat around the small kitchen table in Ryan's house like they'd been doing it forever. Sophie talked about her day at school, about the science project on volcanoes, about how her friend Olivia had the best sticker collection, but Sophie's was pretty good too. Daniel listened and added his own stories, and Ryan watched them both with something that felt dangerously close to complete happiness. After dinner, Ryan handed Daniel a small package wrapped in black cloth. "What's this?" Daniel asked. "Open it." Inside was a patch. Embroidered letters on leather backing, meant to be sewn onto the vest that Daniel wore everywhere now. 2 words, "Family first." "Every Hell's Angel earns their patches," Ryan said quietly. "This one? You earned it the day you saved Sophie. But it took 6 months for the club to make it official. You're one of us now, Daniel. Really one of us." Daniel traced the letters with his finger, his eyes burning with tears. He didn't try to hide anymore. He'd learned it was okay to cry when you were happy. That emotions weren't weakness. That being vulnerable with people who loved you was actually the bravest thing you could do. Remember that alley where Daniel used to hide? The one between 7th and 8th Street, where he'd wedged cardboard behind a dumpster and called it home? The Hells Angels had transformed it. Cleaned it out. Brought in soil and lumber. Built raised garden beds and planted vegetables that anyone in the neighborhood could harvest. They'd put up a little sign, "Community Garden. Take what you need. Give what you can." It wasn't charity. It was a statement. A reminder that invisible people existed, that they mattered, that somebody cared enough to create a space where they could be seen and fed and treated with dignity. On a Saturday morning, Daniel stood in front of a room at the 3rd Street shelter, looking out at 15 faces that wore the same expression he used to wear, weary hope mixed with the kind of exhaustion that comes from surviving when the world wants you to disappear. Ms. Lee stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, tears already forming in her eyes because she understood the poetry of this moment. The boy who'd learned CPR in this very room 6 months ago, who'd paid attention like his life depended on it, was now teaching others. "My name is Daniel," he began, his voice stronger than it had any right to be. 6 months ago, I was living on the streets. I learned CPR here because I wanted to be ready. Just in case. I never thought I'd actually use it. But then a little girl fell off her bike and stopped breathing, and everything I learned here, everything Ms. Lee taught me, it saved her life. He paused, looking at each person in the room. You never know when you'll be someone's miracle. But you can be ready. You can be brave. You can show up. That's what I'm here to teach you today. For the next hour, Daniel demonstrated chest compressions on the training dummy, explained rescue breaths, walked them through the steps with patience and clarity, answered questions, encouraged the people who were afraid they'd do it wrong. Doing something is always better than doing nothing, he told them. Even if you're scared, even if you're not sure, trying to save someone is always the right choice. Ryan stood in the back of the room, Sophie holding his hand, watching this boy who'd become his son teach courage to strangers. 6 months ago, Ryan had been ready to throw Daniel aside, had seen danger where there was heroism, had almost let fear override everything that mattered. Now he understood. Sometimes angels wear second-hand shoes. Sometimes heroes are the ones society overlooks and ignores and decides aren't worth seeing. Sometimes the people we're quickest to judge are the ones most ready to save us. And sometimes family isn't born. It isn't about blood or biology or legal documents, though those help. Sometimes family is chosen. Earned. Built from courage and gratitude and 23 motorcycles rolling down a quiet street to say, asterisk, you're one of ours now. Asterisk built from a father learning that brotherhood means showing up. From a community deciding that invisible children deserve to be seen. From a boy who'd lost everything finding out that sometimes, when you save someone else, you save yourself too. The local news picked it up first. A human interest story about a homeless boy who saved a biker's daughter, about a motorcycle club that responded with compassion instead of the violence people expected. Channel 5 ran it during the evening broadcast, and by morning, it had been shared 3,000 times on social media. Then the regional outlets picked it up. Then the national ones. Within a week, Daniel's story was everywhere. Newspapers. Morning shows. Online publications that usually focused on conflict and division, suddenly desperate to share something that restored faith in humanity. The Hells Angels, usually portrayed as villains in leather, as the dangerous element that law-abiding citizens should fear, were being called heroes. Not just Ryan and his chapter, but the broader organization found themselves in an unfamiliar position, being celebrated for what they'd always known they were. Brotherhood. Family. People who showed up when it mattered. Other motorcycle clubs started paying attention. The Iron Riders in Detroit launched a mentorship program, pairing club members with at-risk youth. The Desert Hawks in Arizona partnered with homeless shelters to provide job training. The Coastal Brothers in Oregon started a scholarship fund for kids aging out of foster care. It spread like wildfire, this idea that tough men on motorcycles could be protectors instead of threats, that strength could be used for building up instead of tearing down. The 3rd Street Shelter received donations that changed everything. Enough money to hire a full-time CPR instructor. Enough to provide certification courses for free to anyone who walked through their doors. Ms. Lee cried when she saw the checks, overwhelmed by strangers deciding that teaching homeless people to save lives was worth their money. Daniel and Ryan became speakers. Schools invited them to talk about courage, about family, about showing up when the world tells you to look away. They stood together in gymnasiums and auditoriums, this father and son who'd found each other through crisis, and told their story to thousands of students who'd never thought twice about the invisible people they passed every day. Heroes don't always look like what you expect, Daniel would say, his voice steady now, confident in a way that 6 months of belonging had built. Sometimes they look like a girl who needs help. Sometimes they look like bikers on motorcycles. Sometimes they look like the person you're ignoring on the street corner. The city council took notice. Councilwoman Martinez, who'd been pushing for homeless services reform for years, saw an opportunity. She drafted legislation requiring CPR and basic first aid training in all public assistance programs, shelters, food banks, community centers. If Daniel had learned CPR because a shelter offered training, how many other lives could be saved by making that standard instead of optional? They called it Daniel's Law. It passed unanimously. The boy who'd been invisible 6 months ago now had legislation named after him, a permanent reminder that preparation and compassion could change everything. One afternoon. One fall. One boy who refused to run away when running was all he knew. That's how you change a city. That's how you prove that family isn't about blood. It's about showing up when someone needs saving. Daniel saved Sophie with CPR. The Hells Angels saved Daniel with community. But who saves the thousands of other invisible children still living in alleys, still eating from dumpsters, still wondering if anyone would notice if they disappeared? That answer starts with people like you. If this story moved you, do 3 things. First, subscribe because stories like this remind us that goodness exists, that unexpected heroes walk among us, that hope isn't naive, it's necessary. Hitting subscribe means you're choosing to see people others ignore, choosing to believe that ordinary moments can contain extraordinary courage. Click it if you're standing against indifference. Second, comment, "No more invisible kids." Every comment is a vote for compassion over judgment, for action over apathy. Let's flood this section with people who believe every child deserves a chance, who understand that society is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable. Make your voice count. Third, share this video. Someone in your life needs to remember that one person can change everything. That courage doesn't require resources, just heart. That angels wear second-hand shoes. Your share might reach someone who's given up hope, or someone who has the power to help but hasn't been moved to action yet. The trolls will say this is too good to be true. The cynics will claim it's staged. But Ryan, Sophie, and Daniel don't care what critics think. They're too busy building family from fragments, proving that brotherhood beats blood every single time. So what's it going to be? Will you scroll past, or will you stand with the people who stop, who see, who save? Hit subscribe. Join the community. Be the person who shows up. Because the next time someone needs saving, it might be you holding the power to be their miracle. Welcome to the family.